G'day legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day, and so far you are having a fantastic week. Now of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over, but we're going to go not only from the battlefield front line to politics today, we're going to look a fair bit further down the line at something that you and I have spoken about and speculated about now for some time. And this is the re-engagement from the West with Russia. And we've spoken about this due to the rise of China and how the relationship between Russia and China that mutually benefits themselves militarily, strategically and tactically does scare the West. But also how China, they might be looking at some actions to gain a lot more than just a relationship. So today we're going to talk, that's going to be the meat of this video, is could there be Chinese action? Could there be re-engagement politically? How would that look? We're going to look from intelligence reports to theories to history about foregoing some liberal ideals to work with a party we typically wouldn't, but when there is a rise of a greater threat. So we're going to talk about that. But where we're going to start is we're going to talk about the maps. We're going to talk about Europe doubling down, India doubling down, and what Trump has said. At this point in time, Trump, what he says, we're going to take with less and less of a grain of salt. But let's talk about the maps. And of course, we have Ukraine on the center screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, as per likely the title of this video, we're going to come to Kupiansk. Now, what I will say, this map, this is the deep state Ukrainian map in with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Now, this map shows acceptance, likely not the extremes of what is occurring. But what we see today is down to Sobolivki, where we saw that Russian DRG about a fortnight ago. The Russia has occupied, confirmed down to here. This means to the center west of Kupiansk, further on this envelopment. Like how everyone who's talking about this, a lot of them are zoomed into here showing this, but not about all the way to Kolesnivkia as well. And this is a huge problem. Now, what we do know is Deep State, they sort of raised the flag too on what was occurring on that Pokrovsk eastern push. So it could be very similar to this too, but this in here, this is a developing crisis at the moment. Now, we know the island boys of Kindrashivkia and Radkivkia, this is likely linked up in here, but Kupiansk is ignored, but very, very important. And it's actually funny today to see some YouTubers, some bloggers who have ignored this for a long time now starting to speak about it. And if they're starting to speak about it, it's likely a lot worse than what we're just seeing on this. But this comes due to attritional warfare and the nature of the war that Russia and Ukraine are fighting, and with one party being numerically superior, the way that we will see this being fought. And this again and again goes into the fairly simple doctrine, simple militarily, meaning like to understand. It's very difficult, I think, ideologically for a lot of people to wrap their head around this. We talk about the collapse without breakthrough and what you're trying to do if you are on the offensive here. That you launch offensives across a broad front, multiple simultaneous thrusts, limited in depth. What do we say? Simultaneous, successive. Instead of concentrating overwhelmingly at one point, the attacker applies pressure at many points along the enemy's line. Each local attack aims to advance just a short distance, and you have multiple areas, you remain inside your bubble of friendly systems. That's why I think Zoloty Diaz and north of there, Russia did overextend, and we saw what happened there. But the intent of this is to stretch and strain the enemy's defenses to the breaking point, where when the enemy, with few reserves, any local crises can set off a chain reaction. Breakthrough in one sector forces the enemy to urgently shift whatever resources they have left to contain it. But in doing so, they weaken another part of the front line. And this can have a cascading effect. What begins as a series of modest advances, they can snowball. Now, will we see this snowball? Eventually, you may if the war continues, but what limitations does drones put on that? Well, we are unaware. The enemy front disintegrates not because of armoured spearhead that reached Berlin in a single dash, but because the entire army lose cohesion under relentless multi-directional pressure. And what we are hearing is that there are emergency redeployments, reinforcements being moved to be put into Kupiansk. And I'm not surprised at all to see increased pressure around Kupiansk, Seversk, following the limited success around Kucherov Yar, Zoloty Kolodyaz, Pokrovsk, Eastern Push. Multiple different sectors remain inside a bubble of friendly layered defence, and you're trying to have redeployment of forces and create a crisis somewhere. And it does appear, as many are saying, that there is a transfer of troops. So what we may see is this then be actually settled, and we may see that this come to a hold, but then we might see another area in the south or in the east somewhere start moving. So then let's go down to Pokrovsk and have a look. And on our way down, we'll talk about some areas on the maps that are showing different today. Of course, the red check is Russian advancement, if you haven't got that by now. Now, typically it's blue check for Ukrainian advancement, so I don't get why this isn't in blue check today, but Novomayalivkia, that the deep state is saying has come back under control of the Ukrainian forces today. We know there's increased pressure, a lot of pressure around the Liman, Seversk North front. And we'll come down, and of course we have Pokrovsk, Rodyanske areas you are familiar with. We see some red check around Udashne as well. So we do have a fair bit to talk about in here. We look at the Suryak's maps, and he's showing somewhat differently in here, that he's saying that the Russian army intensified operations at the centre and western parts of Udashne, and that the Ukrainian army managed to ran to the northern part of Novomayalivka and is trying to consolidate on these positions. So just down to the southwest of here. So showing somewhat differently in here, but again, it's still very minor. The bit that a lot of people are, of course, speaking about is this movement towards Murnay. And of course, coming in from this Novokonomanchny front area that we saw the geolocations and many mappers speaking about this. So let's have a look at what is happening in here according to Thorkill 65. Now, if you're not aware of where this is Murnay just here. The labelling is no good, but we have Malanivkia, and that he's suggesting from his map that the Ukrainians are trying to move to the east towards Malanivkia. Now, he says available scrap indicate that the crisis in this area related to Ukrainian counterattack is ongoing and not yet resolved by the Russians. So that it's still ongoing, that they're still pushing, and it hasn't been stabilised yet. The objective of the Ukrainian attack seems to be Shevchenko-Perche, Kopteve area. Kopteve, and we have this Shevchenko-Perche sitting in here. Events for capture, logistical situations for some brigades will become very difficult. So, of course, if you get into Kopteve, there's Shevchenko area in here from Murnay, all these areas out in here from Kucherov Yar to Razine to Novotoretsky, these become much, much more difficult in behind the line. However, it appears after that initial surprise, the command of the 51st Russians has already sent reserve units there, and further territorial advances of other Ukrainians will be very difficult to achieve. Also, very, very risky. There is a large risk, so let's just show this like this at the moment, okay, for just rough drawing. There is absolutely a threat that you can get enveloped physically or vertically by drones. We know Russian Rubicon's working here. You cut off in here and you could lose a lot of your better offensive forces. I've seen multiple people, and including a guy I know fighting in Ukraine, who has said this movement here, this doesn't make any sense to me. The risk versus reward is absurdly massive and outweighed, which we know in attritional war, what you're trying to do is just maintain a positive rate of attrition for yourself, regardless if that is giving up terrain or moving or whatever. That's what you're trying to do. Now let's move our way down. We see Udashne. We come down to the Velika Novosilka area. Now Zeleny Hay, of course, shown in grey, has shown more grey through Zeleny Hay today. I've seen a lot of pro-Ukrainian mappers even taking the piss out of that. Again, I'm not exactly sure what is happening in that sector. We do have a number of geolocations and movements to show. So look at Tolstoy in here, and we'll firstly look at the Suryak map, see what he's speaking about. And he shows that Ukrainian entry back into then Tolstoy, entry onto the western part, and the Russian army has managed to capture most of the locality of Malanivkia and the northern position. So just down to the south of here, we're looking for Malanivkia, that there is further capturing of areas. And this does seem to line up with other geolocations that we have got that would show forces then beyond this. So let's firstly look at this one here in this Zaporizhzhia area. So just to the south of here, we have Temerivka, Zaporizhzhia in here. What we do have is a Russian flag being raised in here, even outside of the grey zone. Now, is this the threshold to say that this has been confirmed occupied, that the red is there? No. Is it definitely grey? Yeah, you've got a enemy force, belligerent working there. It's definitely grey zone out to here, maybe red. We do know this area does have a fair bit of a porous leaking front line. But then we need to look at Voronezh. So, of course, what Surak was saying was Malinivki has come under full Russian control. We see the grey near Voronezh, but we know Voronezh may be red, definitely grey. So in Voronezh right here, what we do see from this footage here is a Ukrainian armoured movement through this area against then what it's saying are Russian positions. So we know Russians are definitely taking up positions in there. The outcome of this attack, well, it is difficult to know, but there's a hell of a lot more movement around the Velika Novosilka front lines in the past, say, week than we've seen in the month previous, but that's still moving a lot. Let's just do a quick roundup on other areas. Let's come right down into the south. We see Plavny, Stepnogorsk, Kupiansk area. Surak, he's claiming that there's been further eastern push to the northeast of Kupiansk today. We'll come into, of course, I refer to it as the Toretsk front line, but the Konstantinivka pocket that Surak is suggesting today, that right down here, Katerinivka pocket, that there's been further Russian movements then squeezing this back. And this is a critical area that is growing more and more critical by the day. But that will wrap up all of our maps today. So I said that Europe is doubling down, and we see articles like this ever, and I've just put some of these on a slide. Norway is planning to allocate 8.45 billion in aid to Ukraine in 26. Canada is talking about 1.24 billion euros. Germany is talking about $10.5 billion across the remainder of 25 and 26. And what we do see is that Europe is doubling down on support for Ukraine. While there's no addressing, though, the elephant in the room, which is manpower. A lot of this funding will go offshore into US industry. So this provides little economic incentive for Trump to end the war. We know Trump is trying to rebuild manufacturing. And you know, it's the problem with manufacturing is once you build something, once you build a car, someone has that for 10 years. You know, the beauty of defense stuff is it gets blown up somewhere and you have to rebuild another one, and offshore money coming in, funding that system and funding industry, funding manufacturing. So there's very little economic incentive for this. The US is now not paying. Are these game-changing figures? No, nowhere near it. We saw the 60 billion was not game-changing. The first 200 billion, well, as Trump would say, 300 billion has not been game-changing. If this number was in the 100 plus billion, you know, that's when we could really start talking about, yeah, maybe, but that's going to have to come with hundreds of thousands of mobilized, motivated soldiers as well. So likely this war will continue dragging on until we see that fall off a cliff that we may see. And I've always said you could be on the eve of it or you could be a decade away from it. And Trump has spoken about European security guarantees and where America will be sitting here as well.
And we'll see. Number one, Europe is going to give them significant security guarantees, and they should because they're right there. But we'll be involved from the standpoint of backup. We're going to help them. And I think if we get a deal, and I think we will, but if we get a deal, you're not going to, I don't believe you're going to have much of a problem. But we'll back it up because I want to stop seeing people being killed, you know.
So that there will be backup, significant security guarantees, and Trump has talked about, you know, further somewhat ultimatums as well. But we've seen, of course, all of those then fall apart. These security guarantees, though, this is the problem because NATO is a security guarantee, and that's exactly what Russia doesn't want. And that's what we've spoken about. Whether it is called NATO or whether you're referring to it as de facto NATO, that's still going to become a problem. That's not going to end then the war. That's where this whole thing is just reached ahead that will likely continue fighting because I just don't see that there's any middle ground that's ever going to be found. Lavrov basically spelled that out yesterday, and so did Zelensky for his independence address also. So I spoke about this re-engagement with Russia due to the growing hegemony of China. And this does scare the shit out of out of Australian strategists, everyone from military through to politics, through to economic, through to AI developers as well. So this is what got me thinking about this today, and then I went on a bit of a hunt for some further information, and we're going to go through some books and stuff today. But China's Xi to host Putin, UN's Guterres at a regional summit, and this is the SCO summit that we spoke about maybe last week, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Xi will host Putin, a lot of other leaders here, aimed at cementing China's regional influence. This is in Tianjin on August the 31st. We've seen that this gathering takes place before Beijing stages one of its largest military parades in years, as US President Trump's foreign and trade policies, particularly on Israel, Gaza and tariffs, nudge key regional players closer to China. The leader of Iran, Indian leader, will be there as well. So will the Malaysian Prime Minister. And we've seen what I believe he's the backup Minister of Foreign Affairs. That's not the right word. The acting, maybe, been here saying the more turbulent, complex international situation becomes, the more important it is for countries to strengthen unity and cooperation. And there's always been fear of a cooperation between Russia and China, whether it was the Soviets and Mao or whether it is over the past few decades. So let's have a look at this. And I know a lot of people say, that's no way this is ever going to occur. Trust me, there's a lot of people who are fearful of something like this. We get this very recently, it's only been in the past couple of weeks, from ASPI, which is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, with an article titled, "The West Should Still Look Towards Peeling Russia Away from China." Shit, that is not going to be popular. It speaks about this in it. As tension grows between China and the West, Moscow drifts further into Beijing's orbit. A strategic question is emerging. In 1971, the US opened to Mao's China to weaken the Soviet Union. Could a future recalibration, this time towards Russia, and by all of the West, help limit China's regional dominance? Now, what we know is, on the global stage, we act very differently to what has or is being said in rhetoric. And we do know that this has occurred before, and we're going to talk about Mao in a bit, but we're going to just step back more onto this idea of the way we act, and our rhetoric can be very different. And Mr. John Mearsheimer, in The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he does speak about this, that he does say this is that there's a practice and rhetoric. Because Americans dislike realpolitik that we speak about. Public discourse about foreign policy in the US is usually couched in the language of liberalism. Hence, the pronouncement of policy elites are heavily flavoured with optimism and moralism, or more of a utopian liberalism, rather than this idea of realpolitik that you may see. But in essence, a discernible gap separates public rhetoric from the actual conduct of American foreign policy. And the conduct versus the rhetoric is what we're getting at, that this can be very different. The gap between rhetoric and reality usually goes unnoticed in the United States itself. Two factors account for this phenomenon. First, realist policies sometimes coincide with the dictates of liberalism, in which case there is no conflict between the pursuit of power and the pursuit of principle. Under these circumstances, realist policies can be justified with liberal rhetoric without having to discuss the underlying power realities. And I think you'll be able to wrap your head around how rhetoric, reality, realpolitik, realism and liberalism, we've spoken a lot about these. The idea of engaging Russia may be politically unpalatable right now, but long-term strategy demands creative thinking. Perpetual isolation would only accelerate Russia's dependence on China. As China and Russia grow closer, their partnership is uneven. Russia leans on China for markets, technology, diplomatic cover. China, meanwhile, gains influence in Central Asia and the Arctic, cheap energy, and possible sorts of continental supply of resources in case sea routes are cut in a war. And this is something you and I have spoken about at length for some time, is that Russia and China's strengths and weaknesses, they both complement each other very, very well. So Chinese sea routes could be cut. They don't have that long, relatively, of a frontage to the ocean. But who does? Russia. Massive amounts of ability for naval actions into blue and green water areas. So we absolutely understand that. We understand where there's bits of technology that are complementary, where there's strengths and weaknesses as well, even down to grain and wheat and agriculture too. So Mr. Iskandar Rahman, in his Planning for Protraction, he explains this very, very well too. That one of the big ones in this is then Beijing is now projected to produce nearly twice as many STEM PhD graduates as the US in 2025. That should be ringing alarm bells. But we do see this. If Beijing does shed its traditional mistrust of alliances, the current Chinese, Russia entente, morphing into a proper formalised mutual security agreement, this could pose a significant and lasting challenge to US military dominance and allied strategy in the region. Moscow might, for example, opt to provide Beijing with several of the apex military technologies it so desperately needs to overcome some of its few remaining sectoral weaknesses, either in anti-submarine warfare and nuclear submarine design. So what we see is areas where Russia can be world leading in especially nuclear propulsion, anti-submarine, submarine and EW, that China may absolutely be looking for that. But where Russia lags behind China, especially in manufacturing, China may want some of that. Where China could be blockaded potentially and not completely self-sufficient on food, Russia can absolutely help with that. And this is what we're getting at, is it can be that mutual benefit, strength and weaknesses, makes this incredibly, incredibly dangerous. So firstly, in the event of a Sino-US war, so China-US, Russia, with its bountiful reserves of energy and grain, could emerge as China's great continental resource reservoir. Even down to, that this doesn't speak about it, is into artificial intelligence. We know AI, there's a race between the US and China. It's believed the US is a couple of months ahead. What AI requires is massive, massive amounts of cheap energy. And who can provide and who wants to provide cheap energy because it can fuel the government, war machine, everything, is Russia. But we do know that this is not a formal axis yet. But if left unchecked, we could see deeper alignment. China does not have any formal military ties, but there is risk of this happening. A permanently isolated Russia could give China even more freedom to push its strategic agenda. It could be even more confident than now of Moscow backing it in international forums and disputes. But a more autonomous Russia, eventually after the war under new leadership, might not be so eager to toe China's line. See, he's saying that there has to be a new leadership. I still don't know. Historically and fundamentally, Russia and in Moscow is fundamentals of society much closer to European West than it is to China, from religion to language to history. Historically, Russian and Chinese interests have clashed more often than they have aligned. In Central Asia and the Arctic, and even in Northeast Asia, these two powers have competing ambitions. We should be thinking now about how to use that. And even when these were both communist states, they did not see eye to eye. And Henry Kissinger in On China, he talks about this a lot through China confronts both superpowers, of course, speaking about Mao and the Soviet Union at the time, and then into Khrushchev as well. But ideology has brought Beijing and Moscow together, and ideology drove them apart. There was too much shared history, raising question marks. Now, that was just the best little outtake I could find, but that chapter, what chapter actually is it in here? No, that's too... I'll find the chapter for you, but that's definitely something you should read to get an idea. When people say that these two, China and Russia are inseparable, go and read the Sino-American confrontation, or China confronts both superpowers. Definitely worth a read in that. It's not something that can be put into action until someday Vladimir Putin leaves the stage. I'm unsure about that. In discussions with other Western countries, Australia should promote the idea of eventual re-engagement with Russia. It should do so quietly, making clear that this does not imply any easing of the consequences imposed by Moscow for its invasion of Ukraine. Sanctions have weakened Russia, but also pushed it deeper into Beijing's orbit. We should not reward aggression, but diplomacy is rarely about moral purity. If we don't think ahead, China will, and already is, looking locking in long-term energy deals, expanding its economic leverage, and aligning with Moscow in multilateral forums that challenge Western influence. Before Nixon, his security advisor Henry Kissinger took the initiative in 1971, no one imagined that the president sitting with Mao, but it worked. The move helped ensure the 1960s break between Moscow and Beijing would continue and gave US leverage for decades. We're not in the same situation, but the lesson still applies. Uncomfortable diplomacy can create strategic space. And absolutely, what we do see is we will work with states that we typically wouldn't work with when we have a common enemy or greater threat. Think about World War II working with the communists. Australia has limited leverage alone, but as a regional actor with global ties, we have a voice. Quietly encouraging our partners to consider a long-term plan for re-engaging Russia under the right conditions could prove valuable. At the very least, it gives us options. So I found that very, very interesting to look at how this re-engagement is being floated by a lot of people, something that we have spoken about, there was rumours of for a very, very long time. And then we see this, that this is a second opinion, somewhat with the same outcome, but different. And I don't think it aligns with some of China's strategic patience, but you might find this interesting. So Alexander Raynor had this article on the 4th of August called "Will Russia Join the West Against China?" While Mr. John Legren's geopolitical analyst in The Hill demonstrates why China might pivot from Taiwan to target Siberian resources, his assessment overlooks crucial geopolitical consequence. A Chinese invasion of Siberia could paradoxically accomplish what decades of Western diplomacy have failed to achieve, driving Russia decisively back into the arms of Europe and the United States. The current Sino-Russian partnership, often described as having no limits, rests primarily on shared opposition to Western hegemony rather than genuine strategic alignment. This marriage of convenience has mainly endured because both nations face pressure from the same adversary, the United States. Citing this New York Times article, which leaked Russian intelligence documents, now will show rising concern over China. Longer run proposes that China may transform from partner to predator, causing Moscow's entire strategic calculus to undergo a seismic shift. Given the current unpredictability of American foreign policy, a shift away from Taiwan may be prudent. Aggression against Taiwan may prompt a US response, both militarily and economically. While Russia appears to be in control of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, it is also apparent that Russia is nowhere near as strong as it initially seemed. That Russia has not delivered a lightning-fast victory in Ukraine, and the conflict continues to drag on with the renewed threat of US involvement in the conflict as President Trump promises more weapons shipments and further working with European partners to then further fuel into Ukraine and the war there. Now, what I will say is this sort of aggression doesn't align with China's strategic patience, although we have speculated that China may exploit opportunities if it arose. And we spoke about this years ago when there was the promised Russian collapse from every dick and their dog, that Russia's going to economically collapse and it's going to turn to turmoil, that we said China may take opportunity there to maybe stabilise situations, stabilise certain markets and exploit that for then their one China policy and outlook of all under heaven, or Tanjay, I believe it is referred to. That may be incorrect, but this is, I think it would be more exploiting opportunity at a black swan event rather than militarily. It doesn't fit within the history that we have seen either. A Chinese invasion of Siberia would represent an existential threat to Russian territorial integrity in a way that Western sanctions and diplomatic pressure never could. Unlike proxy conflicts and economic competition that have defined recent East-West tensions, Chinese territorial aggression would strike at the very core of Russian national identity and survival. Faced with the loss of resource-rich eastern territories, the economic lifeline that has sustained Russia through decades of international isolation, Moscow would have little choice but to seek powerful allies capable of matching Chinese military might. But at the other hand of this, it isn't about wanting to help Russia, it's also that the lesser evil and further of a footprint, Chinese footprint, in Eurasia as well. From Russia's perspective, the West suddenly becomes not the primary threat, but the potential saviour European nations, the US and the US, despite their current antagonisms with Russia, share a fundamental interest in preventing Chinese hegemony over Eurasian resources. The prospect of China controlling both its domestic energy reserves and Siberian oil and gas would create an energy monopoly and threatens Western economic security as much as Russian territorial integrity. Now, again, the reason I push back on this is I just don't see that China has to do this militarily. It's given China the perfect opportunity of freezing Russia out of all these markets. So they go, well, we'll come in and we'll buy it. And it's much cheaper to do that and work with it, even if you're buying it at a higher rate than if you had to go there and do it yourself. This convergence of interests could rapidly reshape decades of geopolitical alignment. Russia's vast military-industrial complex, nuclear arsenal, and intimate knowledge of Chinese military capabilities would become invaluable assets to Western alliance suddenly facing an expansionist China. Moscow's energy resources, those not seized by China, would provide Europe with an alternative to Chinese-controlled supplies, while Russian territory could serve as a crucial buffer and staging ground for any coordinated response. So let's have a look further at then these strategic implications that it speaks of too. Western policymakers should recognise the opportunity that Chinese aggression against Siberia would present. Rather than viewing it as a distant conflict between two authoritarian powers, the West should prepare for the possibility of a dramatically altered geopolitical landscape where Russia becomes a potential partner against Chinese expansion. Such partnership would not require the West to forgive or forget Russian actions in Ukraine, Georgia, or elsewhere. Instead, it would represent a pragmatic alliance born of shared immediate interests, preventing Chinese control of Eurasian energy resource and maintaining the balance of power that has underwritten global stability. Why is the US worried about this? Russia is the idea that Russia-phrenia, the idea that Russia is on the verge of collapse, but also of being the global hegemon at once. We know both can't be true. Russia is not even close to being a global hegemon. It's behind many, many other nations. China, that represents the real risk. And will the US, which is not required to forgive and forget, but to have a mutually beneficial relationship to draw away from helping China's rise exponential? The precedent exists in history. As we spoke of, the US and Soviet Union set aside ideological differences to counter Nazi Germany, despite Stalin's previous aggression and authoritarian rule. Similarly, Chinese territorial expansion could create an external pressure necessary to forge a new, if limited, Russian-Western alliance. And there is a real threat about this. For Russia, losing Siberia would mean economic collapse and a reduction to a second-tier power. For the West, Chinese control of domestic and Siberian energy would create dangerous dependence and vulnerability. These shared interests of preventing China's resource dominance could override the current antagonisms that divide Russia from the West. Now, in both these articles, so this one here, will Russia join, so saying that China is going to have military action? The reason I disagree on that one is I think that can be done without military action and done far cheaper with far less cost than military action. But this one here, as well as peeling Russia away from China, that depends on then Putin dying of stage 55 cancer. I also don't think it needs the requirement of the replacement of Putin either. So that's the two bits that I disagree on there. And I'd love to know behind the scenes in the Pentagon, in the White House, the discussions around Russia may be a threat to Eastern Europe. They are not a threat conventionally, leaving nuclear out of this. They are not a threat conventionally, militarily to America. They're a threat to international oil and gas markets, but not militarily. Their latent power, potential power, excluding nuclear weapons, is very low compared to, say, the US. What is a real threat to US dominance, hegemony leading through the rest of this century absolutely is China. A larger GDP with purchasing power parity, massively larger population, and America losing soft power absolutely everywhere due to its policies to do with Israel. So there's real threat of this. And we said in one of those, it said that there was a New York Times article, and we'll bring this up because it says, and it's titled, "Secret Russian Intelligence Document Shows Deep Suspicion for China." Now, again, this could also be a Western intelligence operation to sow distrust too. So with any intelligence leaks, you also need to say that this could be an intelligence operation within itself of the CIA hands something off the New York Times, fronting as the FSB, or you start this island over here by some just mythical billionaire who has no ties back into anywhere in the Middle East, and then we bury all of that. But in public, President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia says his country's growing relationship with China is unshakable. Strategic military and economic collaboration that has entered a golden era. But in the corridors of Lubyanka, the headquarters of Russia's domestic security agency, known as the FSB, a secretive intelligence unit, refers to the Chinese as the enemy. And what we will say with all great states, there is no such thing as permanent friends or enemies. The unit, which has not been previously disclosed, has warned that China is a serious threat to Russian security. Its officers say that Beijing has increasingly tried to recruit Russian spies and get its hands on sensitive military technology at times by luring disaffected Russian scientists. Any great state that sits on your border is a huge threat to security. Even if you were aligned at the time, it becomes a huge threat to security. Russia shares a border with China, and where it doesn't share a border, you've got fairly weak states between. It is whether they're having a hand shandy-a-thon in Moscow or Beijing, you still need to take into account that, hey, there's still a state here. Things can change very rapidly. We've actually spoken about this, you and I, at length about the remilitarization of Europe, that there still will be an increase of tensions between European states who are having a hand shandy-a-thon in Brussels, but there still will be increased tensions there that we may not even see. But if Germany remilitarizes to the hilt, what have we seen over the past couple of decades when that happens from Bismarck and Prussia onwards? We do see increased tensions. Now, whether it will boil over or not, I think the institutions will keep a lid on that. Any state on your border, that if New Zealand said we want fucking nuclear weapons, Australia would be sitting going, why? The intelligence officers say that China is spying on the Russian military operations in Ukraine. I wouldn't even say spying. I think it's a lot of it be handed over with a to and from trade to learn about Western weapons and warfare. They fear that Chinese academics are laying out the groundwork to make claims on Russian territory. And they have warned that Chinese intelligence agencies are carrying out espionage in the Arctic using mining firms and university research centres as cover. We know the MSS, the Ministry of State Security, basically China's CIA, if you will, they have a larger reach, at least human, allegedly, than any other group in the world, through universities massively, through into mining companies. Apparently the web of that is of what is known is more than the rest of the world combined, of what I've at least heard. The threats are laid out in an 8-page internal FSB planning document obtained by the New York Times that sets priorities for fending off China's espionage. The document is undated, raising possibility that it is a draft, though it appears from context to be written between 23 and 24. Now, some of the claims in this is the FSB, in this apparently, claims China has been recruiting Russian officers, expert journalists, business people who are close to power. Officers have been ordered to stop transfer of important strategic information to the Chinese. China especially is interested in Russia-Ukraine war lessons, as everyone is, including us too. It says combat methods using drones, modernisation of their software and methods for countering new types of Western weapons. Of course, China has absolute dominance on the drone market. China is targeting military parts and researchers in aerohydrodynamics, control systems, and aeroelasticity. And also, apparently, what's being sought out, according to the document, a Russian specialist or Soviet specialist who worked on the discontinued Ukraine plan. Now, if you don't know what the Ukraine plan is, thing's fucking awesome. The Caspian Sea monster used basically a buffer of the ground effect to be able to go across the Caspian Sea as a massive, massive machine. Could you see China use something like this? Maybe so. We know they want to get across a fair small strait in some areas. So I don't know. We'll see. That's what it claims anyway. The Chinese plan to use experience of Wagner fighters in their own armed forces and private military companies operating in countries Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We did a whole video on this for an hour once about why do you use then private military companies, mercenaries, whatever you want, because you get a level of plausible deniability and a level of disconnect as well. That is funded through someone here and funded through that, and it doesn't come back onto the state. Even if everyone knows that it is, it's not the same as using your state forces. So a lot in that we went over, but we've seen enemies at the fundamental level forgo that rhetoric, those ideals, for some time if facing a larger threat. The best example of this is the Second World War with the capitalists and the communists. But there are many, many examples of where you have liberal rhetoric and then the reality of foreign policy playing out. So will we see bringing back into some sphere? I was in one of my predictions that I think that we will see that. I think we'll see much more of that in the coming months and years as well. Now, we're just going to quickly go over this from the External Affairs Minister in India and this pushback on the US with their tariffs going from 25 to 50% on then crude going to India. It's funny to have people who work for a pro-business American administration accusing other people of doing business. That's really curious. If you have a problem buying oil or refined products from India, don't buy it. Nobody forces you to buy it, but Europe buys and America buys. So you don't like it, don't buy it. And we can see India, they're not leaving any scraps here. They're saying, if you don't like it, don't buy it. But we're going to continue buying this. White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro said on Wednesday that India is running a profiteering scheme by using discounted Russian crude and then selling refined petroleum products at the premium prices in Europe and other places. I refer you, Peter, to 2 paragraphs above. If you don't like it, don't buy it. The External Affairs Minister also wondered why the same yardstick is not being used for China. Some arguments which have been used to target India have not been applied for the largest oil importer, which is China. It has not been applied against the largest LNG importer, which is the European Union. And when people say we are funding the war by putting money in the coffers of Putin, the Russian-European Union trade is bigger than the India-Russian trade. So Europe not putting money into Putin's coffers. Same with the US with then uranium. He acknowledged that India's procurement of Russian crude has gone up in the last few years and noted that it is driven by national interest. It's our right. It's my business. We would say that that's what strategic autonomy is about. Everyone screams about autonomy until someone's acting autonomously in a way that you don't like. We are buying Russian oil to stabilise the oil market. Yes, it's in our natural interest. We have never pretended otherwise. But we will also say it's in the global interest to not spike oil prices, but reasons that in a state, states will always look for their national interest first. Some states, at least. There was a series of explicit conversations saying we have no issues with you buying the oil, and referred to the G7 price cap of oil. The fact that you devised the price cap meant that you accept that there's oil trade going on with Russia, otherwise you wouldn't need a price cap. And the reason by putting in the price cap, instead of just excluding anyone from buying it, is that the trade needs to keep going. The oil can't just skyrocket in price or flood the market and sink it in price and collapse in oil fiscal economies either. So by this price cap and stabilisation, the goalposts have moved across different administrations, but you can see India's frustration in this and that they are not backing down. What will we see? I don't know, but we'll be here to see it. Legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.